Alright, the EC2 instance is created. Now it's time we go ahead and look into the various nitty-gritties and the metadata of this EC2 instance. I'm going to click on it, and as you see, I've got two EC2 instances, but one of them is stopped and the other one is running. Okay, so I can of course go ahead and right click and start this instance as well. And while it is initiating and starting up, let's go ahead and click on the first one and then look at the various options here. Okay, so in the previous lab, we just created one instance, and looks like this instance was created in test-VPC in the following subnet, and it's got an IP address of 3.231.160.56. Now it's a public IP address, right? It also has a private IP address. In fact, it must, because it is hosted in my subnet 1. Okay, so the AMI ID is a Windows Server 2019, so that's my Amazon machine image hosting the operating system of 2019. It has the inbound rule, something like this, just the port number 3389 open from the following source, which is the internet. So I will be able to RDP to this EC2 instance from the internet. Let's see how that works. So I'm going to copy this public IP and then launch MSTSC, which is Microsoft Terminal Services Console, and I will paste the public IP address here. Just go ahead and click on connect, and it should pop up the user ID and password, the credentials prompt right here. Now it's time to go and get the password for this EC2 instance, which we can get it by just right clicking on the EC2 instance, and then you click on get Windows password. Once that is done, you then click on choose file. Now this is the key pair which was generated when we started creating that EC2 instance, right? So if you recall from the previous lesson, we were talking about a public key and a private key, and a handshake of both of these will result in a password. So Amazon has that public key and we have the private key. So you got to do that handshake. Now I will choose the file and browse to the directory, and then as you can see, I've got the new keypair.pem file here, and this is the certificate value. Now I'm going to click on decrypt password, and here is the password that I'm going to use to log in, right? Of course, you can log into the virtual machine and change this password, because there's no way you can memorize this random string, right? So I'll copy this and go back to the credential prompt, type in my user ID and the password, and say OK. Now it should take me straight to the EC2 instance. In one of the previous videos, I did show you how you connect to it and how you make it a web server. And that's where the need for opening new ports comes into picture, right? So if you're making this virtual machine as a web server, you will need port number 80, right? What if you make it as a database server? So let's say if you're installing Microsoft SQL on it, and that needs port number 1433 inbound. So you got to go back to the security groups here, which is right here under the metadata. Click on that, and then under the inbound rules, you can modify the inbound traffic or the ports that you want to allow. For example, at this point I've got port number 3389, and that's why I could RDP to this EC2 instance, because RDP works on port number 3389. But what I'm saying is that if you would like to have HTTP port because this is a web server, or SQL port because this is an SQL server, then you have to add those relevant ports in this list, right? For example, you just go ahead and click on add rule and then select the respective protocol and then type in the respective port number as well, right? So there are a lot of well-known protocols in this list. These are all well-known. For example, HTTP, POP3, IMAP, LDAP, these are well known. But just in case your protocol is not in this list, you can go ahead and type in a custom TCP port or a custom UDP port as well, right? So let's say your application is listening on TCP 1433, right? So you can just go ahead and type in manually here as well. I'll click on cancel and show you some more information about the metadata of the EC2 instance. There you go. So one important aspect is the network interface as well. That's how we are getting connected to this virtual machine, isn't it? No network interface, no communication. The network interface for this EC2 instance is called as ETH0. Let's click on it and then find out what we got. What we have is a public IP address which can be seen right here. What we also have is a private IP address. When we started this class, I did mention that every EC2 instance must have a private IP address, and it has got a private IP address of 192.168.30.233. Now this part, the first part right here, the first three octets represents the CIDR block as well, which is the network ID, isn't it? So this is the network ID which it picked up from the subnet's CIDR block. So what was the subnet CIDR block? It was 192.168.30.0/24. Let's go and verify that. So I'll click on this subnet. It'll take us to a totally new screen in a different tab. Right, so what do we have for this? We got 192.168.30.0/24. So one IP address from this range was allocated to ETH0, and we got .233 as the host ID. Alright, that was about Windows machines. Let's go ahead and create a Linux instance in the next lesson and see how that works. Although there is no difference between creation of a Windows machine versus Linux machine, it's just the same thing. But RDP doesn't work for Linux machines. RDP, or this Microsoft Terminal Services Console, is only for Windows boxes, not for Linux. For Linux, you will use terminal or use a third-party tool called as PuTTY. So we'll download the PuTTY tool and go ahead and connect to the Linux machine. All right. So let's get started with this topic in the next lesson.